This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
UN chief says terrorism a growing threat across Africa. France presses European allies to support Sahel armies against jihadists. And photojournalist in Nigeria defies odds by using one arm to pursue his dreams. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to you live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers. Here are most stories making headlines this hour. In business news, severe drought takes toll on Zimbabwe's fragile economy. And in sports news, Uganda's medal heroes return home following their successful exploits at the IAEA World Athletics Championships in Doha. Well, starting today for the next 2 days, Tanzania will be hosting an international environment and climate change conference. The conference's theme is towards a climate resilient society for the desired sustainable futures in Africa. It's expected to bring more than 300 researchers of climate change from Africa and beyond to discuss, among other things, key policy issues on enhancing resilience. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, hundreds of protesting climate activists have blocked roads in central London. It's a start of a 2-week peaceful disobedience to demand action to cut carbon emissions and avert an ecological disaster. Well, for more on that, we are now joined by CGTN's Daniel Kija in Dar es Salaam and Naveed Japek, who is in London. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Daniel. Could you just explain to us about this conference that has now started and what we are expecting on the agenda to be high on the discussion for today?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This conference is part of the third Africa Climate Talk. It's in its third edition. Now, because of Africa being the most vulnerable due to its dependence on farming, climate change is a serious issue for the continent. There are basically two main agendas for this conference. One is to basically look at the latest science on climate change, and two, to seek ways in which science can influence public policies, because reports have been pointing to climate change being very real and being caused by human actions. So in the end, the conference aims to look at the research that's been done, that it should not just end in publication and in papers in universities, but to be applied by policymakers and change makers and influence public policy that can change lives as well as protect the environment. So basically, that is the essence of what this conference is about.
Naveed, in London, I'm going to come to you. Hundreds of protesting climate activists blocked roads in central London to launch a 2-week protest. What is the latest on that?
Well, in the past hour, we've heard from the Metropolitan Police here in London. They say the figures they have is 319 people have now been arrested in London, that is, and a 24-hour policing plan remains in place. But in the past 24 hours, we've seen the protests shift a bit. There's been a change in the way the protests have been taking place. This morning, the Home Office here in London, that's the Interior Ministry, as well as the Department for Transport, saw protesters glue themselves to those buildings. And in the case of the Interior Ministry, one of the protesters glued themselves inside in the lobby. So the police have arrested them, and we've also heard from the government as well. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called them, and this is a direct quote, uncooperative crusties. He also called them hemp-smelling and said the nose-ring protesters needed to go home. So some strong words from the British Prime Minister there. Police are still monitoring the situation. There were, yesterday when we were out on the streets, there were plenty of police in Westminster, which is the heart of where all the political buildings in London are. So the protest's still going on. They're scheduled to go on for another 2 weeks, where police are trying to fight back. There were protests in April here in London, so the police this time around seem to have been better prepared.
Naveed, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Kijawik, back to you. Who's attending this conference? Speak to us about that. And also, I think what people are going to be looking at, particularly with this summit, is what is expected and the outcomes that we can expect to come out of this conference.
Well, on this side of the world, there are no protesters, but a lot of scientists, as I've touched on. We know scientists have come from Kenya, Uganda, the US, South Africa, Ghana, and many other countries. But key among them are scientists from the University of Dar es Salaam who are championing this conference, as well as scientists from the Zanzibar University. The conference aims to, at the end of deliberation, the two-day deliberations, to publish a journal that will be shared to policymakers, as well as a policy brief, which will be in line with the objective of making science reflect in public policy making. So they will share the policy messages with the government and parliaments and different governments of Africa, to ensure that eventually these governments will take these findings and the research into policies, into their countries, into their national plans, and eventually help Africa sort of fight climate change. Because as it stands, Africa is still catching up with the rest of the world when it comes to protecting the environment and fighting the effects of climate change. Remember, most of Africa's agriculture is dependent on rain, which now patterns have changed. Even now, as I speak to you, we were not expecting to have as severe rains a couple of years ago. So patterns are changing in urban and rural parts of Africa, and definitely these policy changes are needed for the continent. So hopefully governments will pay heed to scientists and eventually impact climate change in a positive way.
Thanks for that, Kija. Naweed, I'm back with you. The Extinction Rebellion activist group, we've seen quite a lot of them being mentioned in the reports that we're getting. What is it that protesters, them and other protesters, want? What are they saying that they want? And also, how is government reacting to their demands?
Yeah, I think the line is a bit poor, but if I understood your question, it was around the demands of what the protests are all about. And really, this is what they call criminal inaction from governments. It's aimed at high-level politicians around the world, not just here in London. 60 other cities around the world, Extinction Rebellion is planning protests in the coming weeks. Here in London, they say they're going to try and disrupt people's lives, essentially, for the next 2 weeks, in a bid to get politicians to sit up and listen. 30,000 protesters are expected in London in the coming weeks. So far, the numbers we saw when we were out and about yesterday around Westminster were a lot less than that, but there are several locations this is taking place, and many people had come from across the UK, not just here in London. Some of the protesters we spoke to had come as far afield from Scotland, but there are a few key issues in terms of these protests and how much support they can get. If they continue disrupting people's daily lives, then there is a chance that they may risk ostracizing support for their cause, especially among people who may support the cause for climate change and environmentalism. They may be recycling in their own homes, for example, but they may not agree with these means if it continues to disrupt their lives. There is also the financial impact of closing down bridges and roads. Today, Smithfield's Market, which is the largest, one of the largest meat markets here in the UK, was overtaken by protesters. So there's going to be a cost to businesses as well. But as far as the protesters are concerned, they're concerned about the end goal here. They say that unless we act now, that the climate won't be around for their children and grandchildren, and that's why they think these drastic measures, although they may seem drastic to some, they think they're appropriate when it comes to saving the planet.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. That was CGTN's Daniel Kijo in Dar es Salaam, and Naweed was joining us from London. Well, for more analysis on issues surrounding climate change across the world, we're now joined by Simon Gear, environmental scientist based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Simon, good to see you. Just fill us in on thousands of climate change protesters who took to the streets in cities around the world. Why are we seeing so many protests when it comes to climate change now?
Well, I think what's happening is, firstly, there is this figurehead in terms of Greta Thunberg, who has really captured the heart of media. But also, this is something where the time has come, where teenagers around the world are realizing that it is genuinely their future that they're talking about, and that this is the most pressing issue that they have to deal with going forward. And so I think that it is mostly about a global recognition of a global problem.
Simon, we saw that the climate change was also a key topic at the recently concluded United Nations General Assembly. Do you think that governments in Africa and across the world are taking this issue more seriously despite all the meetings that are taking place?
It's difficult to know. I think that the US in particular are openly obstructive to the science on this. I think Europe have generally made quite good strides. China and the third world tends to look at it as a development and a growth issue, and so I think that individual governments, where they often are on a, certainly in the democratic governments, they recognise that they need to create policies that work in that time frame, which is a problem, because climate change policies tend to have to be very, very long term.
Simon, speak to us about this conference that's happening in Tanzania right now. Tanzania hosting a global climate conference. How important are meetings such as this one?
They're incredibly important. It's very, very crucial to keep that conversation going all the time, to keep governments honest and to keep regions honest in terms of keeping themselves carbon neutral, or at least moving towards an economy that is carbon neutral. So they're very, very important meetings. And sometimes it feels like it's just a talk shop, but I promise you there's a lot going on behind the scenes there, where people are creating policy, they're creating expectations, and so I'm a huge supporter of those.
Thank you so much, Simon. Environmentalist Simon Gear speaking to us from Johannesburg. Well, meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been voicing his concerns about the growing terrorist threat across Africa. Guterres was addressing the UN Security Council on Monday to discuss preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution. CGTN's Daniela Pearson has more.
Africa is facing a continuing threat from terrorism and violent extremism. The UN's largest peacekeeping missions are on the continent, with over 80,000 troops serving on African soil. And now Africa is also the largest troop-contributing region.
Terrorism is a growing threat across Africa, with serious implications for peace and security everywhere. In the Sahel, terrorist groups regularly attack local and international security forces.
The message was clear from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The UN Security Council's African alliances are needed and appreciated, now more than ever.
We owe these blue helmets our strong and united support through robust funding and strong mandates. I commend the Council's cooperation with the African Union, including with the EU's Peace and Security Council.
In 2000, the Council formally acknowledged how women and girls are not impacted by war and conflict in the same way as men.
Violence against women remains perhaps the most pervasive human rights violation in the African continent and in the region in particular. The absence of and lack of African women participation in formal mediation processes at the peace table, in particular, is an important area of the UN Security Council 1325 agenda that remains poorly implemented.
While African nations are stepping up regional efforts, there may still be a long way to go to achieving peace and stability, especially if women don't have a seat at the table. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
Echoing the United Nations' concern on insecurity in Africa, France continues to push for the reinforcement of security forces in the Sahel. CGTN's Brian Toussaint brings us more.
France is hoping to form a new combined Joint Special Operations Task Force for the Sahel. This is an effort to support local forces who are being increasingly targeted by deadly jihadist attacks. France has been stationed in the region since 2013.
France is particularly active in supporting the joint forces of the G5 Sahel in mobilizing a number of funds. Let me make that clear.
The French government says talks are underway with several countries for potential deployments of special forces to Mali and other Sahel nations in Africa.
More than ever, we are committed to working alongside our friends in the Sahel, working alongside Mali. Mali is not alone in facing this situation. France is particularly committed to the Berkane system.
The idea is to improve on the basic training for forces as well as to free up France's 4,500-strong Barkhane operation. So far, only Estonia has pledged to send 50 soldiers to participate alongside the French troops. Earlier this year, the United Kingdom also said it would send 250 troops to beef up the Mali peacekeeping operations, known as one of the world's deadliest.
Not to mention the United Nations, since we have been very active in the Security Council to ensure that the United Nations mission in Mali is renewed on a regular basis, in contrast with the certain states with the Security Council that wanted to reduce its scope.
Paris is seeking to prevent insurgents affiliated with the Islamic State group Al-Qaeda and others from taking root in the Sahel region. It says if action is not taken, Europe will have to deal with a double-edged sword of both terrorism and illegal migrants. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
Well, staying with security matters, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has strongly condemned attacks against the UN's peacekeeping mission in Mali. It follows two separate attacks on the troops in the country over the weekend. At least one Chadian soldier was killed. 4 others, including a Togolese, were injured. In the first incident, a UN convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device. Earlier the same day, assailants attacked a temporary peacekeeping base in the area of Mopti. Mali has been struggling to restore stability after a conflict erupted in 2012. The Malian government and 2 coalitions of armed groups in North signed a peace deal in 2015 to end the conflict. The UN wants the agreement upheld.
The Secretary General expressed his condolences to the family of the deceased peacekeeper as well as the government and people of Chad and wishes a speedy recovery to those injured. The Secretary General also called on Malian authorities as well as the signatory armed groups to the peace agreement to spare no effort in identifying the perpetrators of these attacks so they can be swiftly brought to justice. He recalls that attacks targeting UN peacekeepers may constitute war crimes under international law, and he reaffirmed the UN's commitment to support the government of people of Mali in their pursuit for peace and stability.
In South Africa, former President Jacob Zuma's son, Duduzane Zuma, took the witness stand on Monday. He appeared before the Zondo Commission, a public inquiry investigating allegations of state corruption and fraud. At the state capture inquiry, Zuma refuted allegations by 6 witnesses, saying that he was a political facilitator of the wealthy Gupta family. He's expected back at the commission today. CGTN's Angela Coppola has more.
One of those witnesses was ex-Deputy Finance Minister Nsibisi Jonas, who claimed that Zuma had called him to a meeting at which a Gupta brother had allegedly offered him over $40 million and the Finance Minister's position if Jonas worked with the family. Zuma firmly denied the allegation.
My view or my version was not requested at the time because there's emphasis on a time frame. This was raised in the media, there was media statements put out. The man went on TV and said whatever he needed to say. I'm not taking away from why he did it. I don't know. He did what he had to do. Good for him. I have no issues with that. Now, what I'm saying is it's the first time I'm being asked this question. The only time I came across it was on a 3.3. I was not given an opportunity by the public protector. You don't see my record in the public protector's report. Maybe you asked why.
Duduzane Zuma was also implicated in a meeting between former Free State Premier Ace Magashule, former Free State Economic MEC Nkolisi Dukwana and Tony Gupta, where bribes were offered. It's another meeting that Zuma says he didn't attend.
I find it even more interesting that I'm always placed in the middle of these discussions. And I happen to be a couch or a lampshade in these meetings. Didn't see anything, I don't say anything. So I find that more interesting.
Then there was the meeting with ex-Minerals Resources Minister Ramachlodi, which took place at the St. George's Hotel during an ANC senior leadership meeting.
The position, Chair, is that I'm denying the points that I mentioned out. This version of events as placed in this document do not reflect the reality at that time. There was no such meeting. The only times I've met him have been in passing. There's been no formal sit-downs or get-togethers. Me meeting him at St. George's Hotel to discuss this subject matter that he's placing forward, because that's what these paragraphs are about, is entirely not true.
It was a case of he said, she said. The 6 witnesses claiming that Zuma was in fact in those meetings and facilitated some of those underhand deals, while on the other hand Zuma is denying ever being present or facilitating any kind of underhand deals. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, more news making headlines after the short break. Here's what you can expect. UN urges resolution to Jubaland dispute over regional elections. And photojournalist in Nigeria defies odds by using one arm to pursue his dreams.
The newly upgraded CGTN website offers optimized coverage of China and international affairs, as well as distinct voices from around the globe. Be the first to know the biggest political news and discover the background to the major decisions. Decode China with a different perspective and get a better understanding of how China sees the world. Go beyond the news with sharp opinions on the events shaping today's world and reveal a China you have never seen before. Listen to entrepreneurs for in-depth analysis of the economy and touch the pulse of new technology via our hands-on videos. Travel back in time with CGTN to learn about China's past and immerse yourself in Chinese culture to discover the stories behind Kung Fu. Get the latest news on Chinese lifestyle, including travel, sports, and nature. Regular productions including Ask China put high-ranking officials on the spot, while C-Lab presents new ways of storytelling via cutting-edge technologies, and Global Stringer delivers unique videos from China and beyond. Take a look at the world from a different angle. See the difference.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Well, the United Nations has urged Somali leaders to resolve a standoff between the central government and the regional states. In August, Mogadishu failed to endorse the election of Jubaland's leader after it failed to meet the required standards. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo has more.
The new guidelines were announced by the Ministry of Interior and Federal Affairs. The 7-page document highlights a detailed procedure on the manner in which regional elections will be conducted in the Jubaland state. 2 months after parallel elections saw 3 leading candidates claim victory in the regional leadership race. Mogadishu has vowed not to recognize the election of all 3 individuals, claiming to be duly elected regional leaders. Instead, it wants a transparent, free and fair election by end of 2019. The inauguration of Ahmed Mohamed Islam as Jubaland leader has failed to take place on more than one occasion in the port city of Kismayo. The central government here in Mogadishu has imposed an air blockade in the port city of Kismayo, restricting Mogadishu-based opposition politicians from attending Ahmed's inauguration. A former Somali president was barred last month from flying to Kismayo. And on Saturday, a chartered flight flew directly from Nairobi to the port city, carrying lawmakers and former regional leaders, defying an early existing ban imposed by the Somali Civil Aviation Authority. Recent developments in the region have caused concerns among Somalia's international partners.
We appeal to Somali leaders as a matter of urgency to repair the fraught relations between the federal government and some federal member states. We also encourage use of dialogue and pragmatic solutions to resolve tensions in Jubaland to ensure they do not impede other priorities.
For now, it remains to be seen if the current leaders in Jubaland will heed the calls from the government and the UN to restart the electoral process, or whether it will push through with the planned inauguration.
Regional states cannot dictate terms and conditions to the government. The elections did not happen according to the required standard. That is evident. The international community also objected to the electoral process in Jubaland and called for consensus before regional elections.
The central government has been at loggerheads with several regional administrations. The fallout is mostly caused by disagreement over resource sharing and elections. Experts now warn that the political fallout risks reversing gains recorded on the ground, including security and the fight against terrorist groups causing havoc in the country. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Well, 9 law students have been arrested and 2 others left injured in Ghana following a clash with the police during a protest. Thousands of law students in the country are demanding reform of the legal education system. It follows mass failure of candidates who sat for an entrance exam to study a 2-year professional course at the Ghana Law School. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rafah reports from Accra.
The clash between the law students and the police occurred when they were prevented from continuing their march to the seat of government, Jubilee House. The students had arranged to present their petition to the president to intervene in the mass failure of law students aiming to study a professional course at the Ghana School of Law. At least 9 students have been arrested and 2 others left injured during the clash with the police.
We are basically asking for general reforms in legal education, and that includes what's happening in Makola. We also think that the entrance exam should be re-looked at. We need an exam that allows for students to have a fair understanding of what the marking scheme is. You go to write an exam, you don't know what they were looking out for.
The Ghana Law School has been recording mass failure for the entrance exams for many years. Some students believe they are deliberately being failed because of lack of infrastructure to accommodate them at the law school. The Chief Justice, who supervises legal education in the country, on the other hand, says she will not allow mass production of lawyers in the country. This year, out of over 1,800 students who sat for the entrance exams, only 128 passed. In 2017, the Supreme Court ruled the entrance examination and interview session used to admit students for the 2-year professional law course was against the Constitution. Parliament passed a bill in 2018 giving the General Legal Council approval to conduct the entrance examination. But many law students still want the entrance exams scrapped. They want to be allowed admission to study the 2-year professional course using their Bachelor of Law degree. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
We'll move to Nigeria now, where about 19 million Nigerians live with some form of disability, the majority of them having very significant difficulties in carrying on with their daily lives. But blogger and photojournalist Masara Kim has gone against all odds to be one of the best in his field. CGTN's Kelechi M. Kalam brings us his story.
Photojournalist Masara Kim doing what he does best, and with just one hand. Kim defied all the odds that life brought his way. He was only 6 years old when he lost his right arm to a life-threatening injury, and being from an extremely poor family made the situation even worse.
I was playing with my friends and fell down and had multiple fractures in my right arm, a little above the wrist. But my parents were too poor to afford quality health care, so I was taken to a local medical medicine store manned by untrained personnel. By the next 24 hours, when my parents could mobilize some resources to take me to a better hospital, I was told, or we were told, that the hand had been infected by tetanus. And by the next 24 hours, we were told that the infection was fast traveling to my chest, and in another 24 hours I was going to die because it was likely going to reach my lungs.
But Kim wouldn't settle for being pitied or bullied. He was determined to make the best of a bad situation.
Having tried the first time, the second and the third time, I realized that I was actually not disabled in the first place, because disability for me, having come to that realization, was simply the inability of the mind to innovate, the inability of the mind to create.
And that has finally paid off. Kim is reputed as one of the best in his field in North Central Plateau State. He's bagged several recognitions for his works. Not just that, he's employing and inspiring several other journalists as well.
Since the very time he got me engaged in this system, honestly, there has been a whole lot of great improvement, and of course the whole wealth of ideas that I had in mind but I could not bring to light he has actually harnessed those things.
In spite of his achievements so far, Kim is not resting on his oars. He hopes to be a leading media mogul in Africa, one that would bring a solution to the current problem of media imperialism. Kelechi Amekalam, CGTN Plateau, Nigeria.
In Tunis, a 26-year-old entrepreneur who once lived on the streets is positively transforming an impoverished neighborhood in the outskirts of the capital with his video game business. He's now influencing other young people who have developed their gaming competencies and abandoned criminality. CGTN's Adnan Shiwashi brings us more.
This PlayStation center has revived the empty street of this popular neighborhood. Mohammed took over the business from its former owner and invested his own savings. 8 years ago, Mohammed's family and friends encouraged him and contributed to the success of the business.
I had no business model and no clear idea in mind. I just wanted to escape poverty and leave the streets. Unemployment causes trouble in poor areas. I prefer to work and earn a living.
This improvised PlayStation store has become a youth center. It attracts students, vocational education trainees and unemployed graduates. Here they can play online for hours and forget their problems.
I come here to dream with my friends and to turn the page on the hardships of life. I study hard and play for fun as well.
Mohammed's project has reduced criminality in the area as well as violence in the local football league. Young people who enjoy the football matches online can accept defeat gracefully in stadium in the real world.
Life is made of successes and failures. A video game player learns from his own mistakes when he is defeated and respects his adversaries. This is our spirit in this boutique and the whole slum.
There are over 3,000 PlayStation and video game centers across Tunisia. This new business has created over 10,000 jobs in inner regions and impoverished areas in the suburbs of the capital city, Tunis. Making new friends, learning English, as well as understanding online football commentary and analyzing games are some of the advantages of playing at the PlayStation Center. Young people here say they just need some support to succeed in any popular neighborhood. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Hong Kong SAR Chief Executive Carrie Lam has condemned the violent protests during her weekly news conference. She says that the livelihoods of thousands has been affected by the chaos. Earlier, we spoke to our reporter Hei Wei for details of the press conference. But first, let's listen to what Chief Executive Lam had to say.
The major focus of today's presser is on the effectiveness of the anti-mask law. Now let's listen to Carrie Lam.
經過咗呢4個月咁混亂嘅情況呢，
Retail, catering, tourism and hotel businesses have been hit worst after 4 months of chaos. Some 600,000 people are working in these sectors. Many of them are junior staff. Some can even be described as being in a condition of no job, no food. These massive disruptions are actually affecting people.
Well, Carrie Lam stressed that it's only days after the anti-mask law officially took into effect, so it needs some time for this law to be effectively implemented. And besides that, Carrie Lam also mentioned that the Hong Kong's economy has been very bad hit by the current unrest, as we just heard from her. And actually, for the first 6 days of October, and that is the national holiday. Usually it will be a peak for tourism, but actually it's very bad. And the number of tourists from the Chinese mainland in Hong Kong saw a decline of over 50%. And also, Carrie Lam mentioned that the economic figures will be released. Figures for the third quarter of this year will be released soon, but she asked me that could be very bad too. And the second thing she mentioned on the presser is that the Legislative Council of Hong Kong will resume on the 16th of October. That's the next Wednesday, and she hopes that this whole operation can be smooth because there is a lot of things for the Legislative Council to deal with. And also, Carrie Lam mentioned that it was planned for her to deliver a annual policy address on the same day of the resume of the Legislative Council on next Wednesday.
The Syrian TV says Turkey's military has launched an offensive in Hasakeh, northeastern Syria, near the country's border with Iraq. Though it's not confirmed by Turkey yet, this comes as the United States began pulling troops out from the northeast Syrian border on Monday, effectively giving Turkey the green light to move into the area. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces have spent years expanding its control across northern and eastern Syria, helped by the US-led coalition against the militant Islamic State. It says it has been stabbed in the back by the US move. Michal Bardavid has more. Well, moving on now, a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration is withdrawing troops from northern Syria, abandoning the Kurdish allies who were instrumental in the fight against the Islamic State. The move paves the way for a long-threatened Turkish military invasion of the region. CGTN's Michal Bardavid is near Turkey, the Turkish-Syria border with the very latest.
The Turkish Foreign Ministry and the Turkish Defense Ministry have both emphasized their readiness and determination in carrying out this operation in establishing a safe zone. For Ankara, there are two main purposes for the establishment of the safe zone: to protect Turkey's border areas and also to ensure the safe return of refugees. According to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, once they establish the safe zone, hundreds of thousands of refugees can return to this area safely back to Syria. Now, it's not clear whether or not Turkey will wait for U.S. forces to entirely pull out of the region in order to carry out this operation, but Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says that it can be carried out any minute now.
There is a phrase that we always say: we can come any night without warning. And our determination remains, because it is absolutely out of the question for us to further tolerate the threats from these terrorist groups.
Meanwhile, Kurdish forces called the U.S. decision a stab in the back and accused the United States of abandoning them. And on Monday, the Syrian Democratic Forces led by Kurds pledged to defend the areas that they control at all costs. I'm Michal Bardavid for CGTN in Shalnur for Turkey.
Time for us to take a short break and return your business news. Here's what's making headlines. Severe drought takes toll on Zimbabwe's fragile economy. And Uganda doubles the fleet on its recently unveiled national carrier.
At the Great War of China. Ni hao.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live, your business news. Zimbabwe's economy is projected to contract by up to 6% this year. The decrease is due to a severe drought that has been taking its toll on that country. According to a report by the state's treasury, Zimbabwe's month-on-month inflation rate is set to fall to around 10% by December this year, before easing to about 2.3% at the end of 2020. The Southern African economy is currently grappling with its worst crisis in a decade. According to international estimates, nearly 8.5 million people in Zimbabwe are facing uncertain food supplies. In attempts to now fix this, President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government has begun buying grain from abroad. However, Zimbabwe is in a race against time and has few financial resources. Well, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which was launched in July, is expected to ultimately lead to a single continental market for goods and services. It should also promote the free movement of people, expand intra-Africa trade, and enhance competitiveness and support economic growth. Angela Coppola has more on the expectations.
During the state visit by the Nigerian leader to South Africa, Buhari and Ramaphosa reaffirmed their commitment to working together in pursuit of economic development on the continent in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's a start, especially when it comes to visa-free business travel.
It would send a very, very positive signal to the rest of the world and of the continent, and may actually serve to counter some of the negative sentiment that we have experienced in the last few weeks and that we may continue to experience.
When it comes to disputes, any agreement is based on the dispute resolution processes that have been agreed to.
So we need to have a dispute settlement system that's protected from political interference. The agreement itself has gone quite a long way to set it up as an independent structure, but we will need defenders of it down the road, I would imagine. And so making sure that there are champions for that process will be critical from a political economy point of view.
That dispute resolution process will be driven by the Secretariat, but it's going to need trade lawyers who can navigate the continental legal issues. It's a specialized area, but it's an opportunity to develop a continental capacity.
Africa hasn't been involved in a lot of trade issues, and where there have been trade issues, they've tended to be settled quietly. So very few cases have gone to the WTO involving African countries. I think one or two against South Africa, and they've normally been settled.
South Africa and other continental powerhouses will have to take the lead to drive the agreement, its implementation and its governance.
Other parts of the continent also need to recognize the strength we have and enable us to actually, in a responsible way, share those strengths. And that's where things about sovereignty and nationalism and so on come in. I think we need to be serious about working with each other to make an African trade agreement work.
The agreement offers both an opportunity and a challenge, and it's up to those leaders across the continent to actually understand that the benefits far outweigh the risks and the challenges. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, Uganda's national carrier, Uganda Airlines, received 2 passenger planes on Monday, doubling the size of the fledgling airline's fleet. The airline received 2 CRJ-900 planes from Canadian manufacturer Bombardier. Each plane can seat 72 passengers. The airline says it is considering expanding its destinations to include Kinshasa, Zanzibar, Lusaka, Asmara, Hargeisa, Djibouti, and Addis Ababa. Uganda Airlines was relaunched in August, with the country eager to take a slice of the region's growing aviation business that is currently dominated by Ethiopian Airlines. Uganda Airlines expects to receive 2 Airbus A330neo planes soon. The first will arrive by the end of the year and the second a few months later. Well, London-headquartered multinational investment bank HSBC is planning to let go of about 10,000 of its employees as a new cost-cutting measure. The latest round of downsizing will target mostly high-paid roles and will be mainly focused on shrinking the bank's operations in Europe. This news comes just a few weeks after the investment bank announced the previous firing of 4,700 employees, about 2% of its global workforce. Those cuts also coincided with the sudden and unexplained exit of HSBC's former CEO. The new restructuring plan at the bank is being partially attributed to economic uncertainty due to an easing monetary policy cycle, unrest in its key Hong Kong market, Brexit, as well as a trade war between the US and China hurting global growth.
This may not be related too much to the situation in Hong Kong right now, because from the reports, they said the focus probably will be on Europe, because Europe are not performing well. So probably mainly the access will be on European business right now. So Hong Kong probably will be affecting the business later on. But I think in the meantime, they are just looking at the operations in Europe, because that is the side which is underperforming the whole company.
Elsewhere, Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has met with Saudi business owners at the headquarters of the Council of Saudi Chambers. At the outset of the meeting, Hamdok lauded the strategic relations between Saudi Arabia and his country. The Prime Minister says the success of Saudi businesses in Sudan will help increase the confidence of international investors. Sudan is currently Saudi Arabia's 7th most important trading partner, with investments for last year totaling $1.2 billion. At the same time, Sudan and Saudi Arabia are set to hold a joint economic forum, this as the two countries seek increased cooperation.
The change that has taken place in Sudan is profound, and it encompasses all aspects of life, including the creation of the suitable environment for investment in our country. We promise you that we will work with you to overcome all the difficulties and obstacles that were facing Saudi investors.
Well, shifting now to Nigeria, where conversations around imposing a tax on vacant houses are gaining momentum. Late last month, a UN housing official urged the Nigerian federal government to impose taxes on its unoccupied or vacant homes. The move is part of efforts to address Nigeria's severe housing shortage, as CGTN's Kelechi M. Kalam now explains.
An abundance of luxury houses in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, and many more are still springing up. But a large number of them have remained vacant for years, and that's in spite of the country's massive housing shortfall, which stands at about 22 million housing units. Recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to adequate housing, Leilani Farah, recommended that taxes be imposed on vacant homes, and that has spurred a huge debate here. Housing development expert Festus Adebayo has spent over 2 decades advocating for better housing for Nigerian citizens. He laments that these vacant houses have been channels for money laundering.
Those who are advocating for that, majority of them are estate surveyors who are selling houses. The people we are talking about are those who looted Nigerian money. And instead of them keeping the money in the bank, have decided to invest the money in real estate. And whenever these houses are constructed, if the value of the cost of the houses is 50 million, they will put a price tag of 100 million, basically to tag the houses down. They don't want cash. They want the property to keep standing. By the way, they have property elsewhere where they are living. This one is just for the purpose of keeping money, because keeping the money in the bank will make the EFCC, the Economic Financial Organization, to pursue them and say they should explain where the money is from.
Aside vacant houses, the challenges facing the Nigerian property market are quite enormous. From costly property registration and construction to unfavorable laws. More so, only a few have access to mortgage financing. Specifically, only about 5% of the 13.7 million housing units are financed with a mortgage. As a result, housing remains far beyond the reach of the average Nigerian worker.
How many mortgage banks is in existence in Nigeria or recognized by the Central Bank of Nigeria? It's an issue. At 59, an ordinary Nigerian cannot walk to a mortgage bank and ask for loan to own a home. It's not possible. The double-digit interest rate is a burden.
Abating the acute housing deficit is one thing that would require a collective responsibility. It's estimated that about $400 billion would need to be invested for the next 25 years to bridge the housing gap. But first, advocates like Festus would want to see a total policy overhaul, one that would eliminate corruption in the system and further boost investors' confidence in the housing sector. Kelechi Mekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
China and the United States are set to begin a new round of trade talks. Negotiations are scheduled on Thursday in Washington, D.C. Beijing confirms its vice premier and chief trade negotiator Liu He will lead a delegation to visit the U.S. Capitol. The White House says both sides will continue discussions on intellectual property rights, non-tariff barriers, and agriculture. The talks come 1 week before the U.S. plans to impose a 30% tariff increase on Chinese products. Trump says the measure will take effect if no progress is made over the next few days. Meanwhile, the U.S. Commerce Department said that it is putting 28 Chinese entities on a U.S. trade blacklist, a filing showing that the U.S. was adding the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region's Public Security Bureau and 19 subordinate government agencies to the entity list over alleged human rights issues in Xinjiang. 8 high-tech firms are also being added for the same reasons. Some of them have voiced strong opposition to the move, saying the U.S. has no concrete evidence. American officials say the announcement was not tied to this week's resumption of trade talks with China. Huawei and more than 100 affiliates are already included on the blacklist. We're now going to take a short break. Here's sports news after that, and here's what you can expect.